Indigenous people are among some of the most marginalized groups in Canada. They face more economic barriers, fewer educational supports, and are imprisoned more frequently than Canadians. In this episode, we'll dive into the roots of racism against Indigenous people. It's not going to be a comfortable or an easy journey, but we can explore this together if you're willing to be part of the solution and take that step. I'm Dr. Pamela Roach, and welcome to the University of Calgary Anti-Racism video series. When Columbus first came, he thought it was an empty land with simple people. In reality, millions upon millions of people speaking over 300 different languages lived here. And they all interacted in a complex network of trade, treaties, and traditions. They survived and thrived in ways that the early Europeans could not. They had rich civilizations that impacted the world in such areas as farming, medicine, governance, math, philosophy, and personal development. Yet Columbus viewed First Nations people as barely human, inferior to Europeans, ready for exploitation and civilizing. This colonial perspective is at the root of racism towards Indigenous people that continues today.
Our natural law says Creator made everything equal and we're all equal. We need to survive together. So racism has no room in there. When they got to the signing of treaty, they used their natural laws, their verbal knowledge, and their oral practices to put together a right and privilege to treaty. And they agreed to sign Treaty 7, or to make Treaty 7. The written document shows rights and privileges in a Western way, written context. So when the treaty was signed at the time, the song that I just sang and the written document never understood each other. There were treaty making and then there was a signing of a treaty, which are two different things. After treaty was signed at Blackfoot Crossing, 1877, they took the document and they put together Indian affairs. They made an act and made an Indian Act. And then that act was a Western imposed written system on the Indigenous communities to follow and be responsible to this new written act. They imposed totally on our natural laws, our verbal knowledge, our oral practices, and all the songs that give us right and privileges. This written document called the Indian Act imposed on and was enforced by the Northwest Mounted Police, like the invitation we got with cannons. So the treatment of Indigenous people right from the beginning was a total misunderstanding.
From the First Nations perspective, the treaty was a sacred pact sanctified through the pipe and ceremony. It was supposed to signal the beginning of a lifelong partnership and sharing of the land. But the British Crown had an altogether different purpose. They wanted to exploit the rich resources of the land, and the First Nations people were in the way. A year before Treaty 7 was signed, the Indian Act had already been passed. The Indian Act was colonial legislation dictating almost every aspect of Indigenous life. The Indian Act has banned Indigenous ceremonial and cultural practices, restricted movement of Indigenous people, imposed a Western approach to governance and education, taken Indigenous lands desired by the government, and privileged men's rights over women. One of the most insidious examples of this intent was removing children from their families and forcing them into residential schools. Since the signing of the treaty, 150,000 Indigenous children were removed from their families and communities. Students were isolated, their culture was disparaged or scorned, and in some cases, they were forbidden to speak their first language. Missionary staff imposed Christian practices and criticized or denigrated Indigenous spiritual traditions.
At a very young age, my grandparents were raising me, and they were told that I had to be taken away to a residential school. There was no trust, there was no respect, there was no love, and there was no wisdom being taught there from the nuns and the priest. And I couldn't speak my language. And because I couldn't speak my language, I was a very quiet person. It made me feel all the loneliness. And I noticed a lot of physical abuse. I seen a lot of sexual abuse. And when I talk about that, I seen in the dorm where we used to sleep, a lot of the young girls would be taken out into another room. And we used to say, oh, those must be their favorites.
Residential schools stripped generations of Indigenous communities of their language and culture, creating generations of trauma that continues today. From the 1960s to the 1980s, Canada's child welfare agencies chose to remove children from their homes rather than providing much-needed community resources and supports. This is widely known as the 60s scoop. Taken from their families, communities, and culture without consent, these children were adopted into predominantly non-Indigenous homes in the United States and Canada. The cultural effects of the 60s scoop and residential schools have been devastating. Now adults, adoptees, and residential school survivors mourn the loss of their cultural identity, feel shame, loneliness, and confusion. Colonialism is not benign. It imposes its worldview through forced assimilation. It attempts to erase other cultures it believes are inferior through genocide, and it sustains this dominance through the erasure of ideas and beliefs and practices of Indigenous people. This is a story of generations of oppression of Indigenous ways of knowing and culture, and it will take generations to heal from that. And before we can move forward, we need to acknowledge the truth of the systemic racism present in all of our contemporary systems, and recognize that we all play a role together to move forward in a good way.